The conference room was silent, except for the hum of the projector, its faint light flickering across John Carter's face as the investor's words sank in. John Carter said, "You're finished, John. No one will back you after this scandal." His throat tightened, but he forced his expression to remain calm. The betrayal wasn't just professional. It was personal, a wound inflicted by someone he had trusted for years. Across the table, Richard Hayes smirked, the satisfaction evident in his narrowed eyes. John Carter said, "So, this is how it ends, with you tearing apart what we built." His voice cracked, betraying the calm exterior he tried to project. Emily Wright shifted uneasily at his side, her loyalty burning in her gaze, but fear shadowing her features. The betrayal spread like wildfire through his thoughts, threatening to consume him. Every whisper of the room pressed down on his chest, suffocating him with the weight of collapse. Yet deep within the turmoil, something stirred, a flicker of defiance that refused to die. John sat alone in his car, rain cascading down the windshield like 1,000 tiny daggers. His hands clutched the steering wheel, knuckles pale from the pressure. John Carter said, "Everything I worked for, everything I dreamed, it's slipping away." His reflection in the mirror showed a man on the verge of collapse, eyes hollow yet burning faintly with rage. He thought of Emily's loyalty, her voice whispering hope even in the suffocating silence. Yet the betrayal gnawed at him, each memory of Richard's smirk cutting deeper. The storm outside mirrored the chaos inside, flashes of lightning tearing across the sky as though mocking his turmoil. The city lights blurred into meaningless streaks, the world moving while he sat still. But as despair clawed at his chest, that flicker of defiance sparked again. John Carter said, "No, this isn't the end. Not yet." His voice trembled, but in the silence, it felt like a vow. Emily's voice echoed in his memory, words she had spoken countless times. Emily Wright said, "You are stronger than you believe, John, and your vision is worth fighting for." He closed his eyes, hearing her steady tone as if she sat beside him. The contrast between her faith and Richard's cruelty was unbearable. He wondered if she could still believe after witnessing that destruction in the conference room. Every breath felt heavy, like dragging a stone uphill, but her presence lingered, tethering him to hope. In that suffocating silence, her loyalty became his anchor, her belief refusing to die even when his own faltered. The storm thundered again, a deafening reminder of chaos, yet through it, he clung to her voice. John Carter said, "If she still believes, then I cannot give up." The words felt like a lifeline, fragile yet unbreakable. John stumbled into his small apartment, clothes soaked from the storm. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books, comfort fighting against despair. He dropped into the chair, head in his hands, feeling the weight of collapse pressing him down. John Carter said, "They think I'm done, that I'll vanish quietly." His voice broke, but anger surged beneath the cracks. He glanced at the walls lined with sketches, notes, and plans that once ignited his spirit. Each piece was a fragment of a dream too stubborn to die. The betrayal still echoed, but the sight of his vision surrounding him reignited a spark. His eyes scanned the room, and for the first time since the collapse, he saw possibility instead of ruin. John Carter said, "If I rebuild from here, no one will take it away again." The storm outside howled, but inside, resolve began to rise. The storm raged outside, but inside the quiet apartment, a new determination brewed. John stared at his vision board, every sketch a reminder of the fire that had once driven him. He traced his fingers across a plan, the papers soft from years of wear. John Carter said, "They tried to bury me, but they forgot I'm a seed." The words felt foreign on his lips, yet carried a weight that steadied him. Images of Richard's arrogance fueled his anger, but Emily's loyalty tempered it with hope. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but surrender was no longer an option. His heartbeat quickened, no longer from fear, but from the stirring of purpose. For the first time in months, he felt alive, not broken. John Carter said, "This is the moment I begin again." The vow lingered, louder than the thunder. The morning light crept through the blinds, scattering golden fragments across John's cluttered desk. His head ached from a night of restless thoughts, but he forced himself upright, eyes fixed on the sketches pinned to the wall. John Carter said, "I can't let their voices drown mine." The bitterness of betrayal was still raw, but Emily's words had burrowed deep, reminding him of who he was. He stared at his own handwriting on a crumpled note, "Believe in your vision." The words looked fragile, but they steadied him like a hand on his shoulder. He felt the hollowness of failure tug at him, but beneath it lay something sturdier: defiance. He imagined Richard's smug grin fading as he rose again from the ashes. The storm had ended, but the silence in his apartment echoed like a battlefield after war. John Carter said, "This fight isn't over. It never was." The vow felt heavier in daylight, less like desperation and more like destiny. John met Emily at a small cafe tucked into a corner of the city, the hum of espresso machines and chatter blending into a quiet refuge. She leaned forward, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, eyes locked on him with unwavering resolve. Emily Wright said, "You've been beaten, but you're not broken." Her voice was steady, carrying the warmth of conviction. He wanted to believe her, but doubt lingered like smoke in his chest. The betrayal had left scars deeper than numbers or contracts. It had shaken his faith in himself. Emily's gaze softened, and she reached across the table, fingers brushing his hand. "Emily Wright said you built this dream once. You can do it again." The weight in her tone was more than encouragement. It was belief. John Carter said, "What if I fail again?" His voice cracked under the pressure. Emily shook her head gently, her eyes fierce. Emily Wright said, "Then you rise again. That's who you are." The city street outside buzzed with life, but John felt strangely detached as he walked alongside Emily. People hurried past, phones pressed to ears, their lives rushing forward, while his felt paused in limbo. Emily Wright said, "Look around, John. This world doesn't stop for failure." Her words stung, but beneath them was a spark of truth. He glanced at a billboard towering above them, advertising a product eerily similar to the one he once dreamed of launching. Rage flared in his chest, but instead of collapsing, it fueled him. John Carter said, "That should have been mine." His voice trembled, not with despair but with fire. Emily placed a firm hand on his shoulder, her grip steady, anchoring him in the storm of emotions. Emily Wright said, "Then take it back. Rewrite the story." He exhaled sharply, the city's noise suddenly sharpening into clarity. For the first time, failure looked less like an ending, and more like a challenge. That evening, John sat across from his mentor, Robert Ellis, in a quiet office lined with books and photographs of past ventures. Robert Ellis said, "Failure isn't the end, John, it's the tuition you pay for wisdom." The older man's voice carried the weight of decades of scars and victories. John leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly, desperation still etched in his features. John Carter said, "I don't know if I have the strength to rebuild." Robert's gaze was steady, unwavering, like steel honed by fire. Robert Ellis said, "Strength isn't about what you feel now, it's about what you choose to do tomorrow." The words struck him harder than Richard's betrayal ever could, because they rang with truth. John's chest tightened, but it was no longer from fear. It was the pressure of transformation. For the first time, he felt the possibility of turning pain into fuel. The silence in the room wasn't heavy but sacred, a moment of awakening. Walking home under the glow of streetlights, John felt the storm within him shifting. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of rain and asphalt, grounding him in the present. He replayed Robert's words, Emily's faith, and his own vow made in the darkness. For the first time, he didn't feel like a man betrayed. He felt like a man tempered by fire. John Carter said, "They can strip everything from me, but they can't touch who I am." His voice was quiet, spoken only to the shadows, but the conviction behind it echoed loudly within. The city skyline loomed ahead, towers glittering like challenges waiting to be claimed. He inhaled deeply, every breath no longer heavy with despair, but charged with purpose. The weight of failure still clung to him, but now it felt like armor instead of chains. John Carter said, "Tomorrow, I rise." The night seemed to listen, carrying his vow into the silence. The morning paper screamed headlines of scandal. John's name plastered across the front page in bold letters. His stomach twisted as he read words twisted to portray him as reckless and dishonest. John Carter said, "This isn't just failure, it's war." He tossed the paper onto the kitchen counter, its pages spreading like spilled secrets. The betrayal had reached the public, and now the world believed Richard's lies. His phone buzzed with messages, some pitying, most condemning. Emily called, her voice urgent, warning him to ignore the noise. Emily Wright said, "They want you broken, don't give them that." He wanted to believe her, but the weight of shame pressed heavily on his chest. Each headline was a blade, each whisper another cut. Yet behind the humiliation, his anger solidified into steel. He could endure being doubted, but he would not endure being silenced. John Carter said, "If they want war, they'll get one." John walked into the investor meeting with a trembling heart, but determination sharpened his steps. The boardroom was sleek, all glass and steel, intimidating in its cold precision. Across the table sat Maya Patel, her expression unreadable as she leafed through leaked documents. Maya Patel said, "These numbers show mismanagement. Why should I trust you?" His blood chilled. Richard's sabotage had poisoned his chances. John Carter said, "Those documents were altered to discredit me." His voice echoed with both fear and conviction. The investors exchanged glances, doubt painted across their faces. Emily sat behind him, clutching her notebook tightly, her silent support anchoring him. The silence stretched. Every second, another nail in the coffin of his credibility. John forced himself to look Maya in the eye, his jaw clenched. John Carter said, "I will prove every word false, and I will rebuild." His declaration filled the sterile room with raw defiance. Later that night, John confronted his former partner Alex Park in a dim bar. The betrayal had been confirmed, and fury burned in his veins. Alex Park said, "You think you were the vision, but without me you were nothing." His words dripped with bitterness, his smile sharp with malice. John Carter said, "You were supposed to be my brother in this." His voice cracked with rage and disbelief. Alex leaned closer, the stench of liquor mixing with betrayal. Alex Park said, "I chose survival. You clung to dreams. I chose reality." The words cut deeper than headlines, deeper than the investor's rejection. John's hand tightened around his glass, knuckles whitening, but he forced himself not to lash out. Emily's face flashed in his memory, her steady faith restraining him from violence. John Carter said, "You'll regret betraying me." The promise was quiet, but in it lay the spark of vengeance. At his parents' house, John faced another battlefield: family doubt. His sister Sarah stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, her gaze sharp with worry. Sarah Carter said, "You've lost everything. Why keep chasing ghosts?" Her voice carried love, but it was laced with exasperation. He leaned against the counter, exhaustion etched across his face. John Carter said, "Because it's not a ghost, it's who I am." She shook her head, lips tightening in frustration. Sarah Carter said, "You're gambling what's left of your life on ashes." The words stung, because they echoed the whispers he tried to silence in his own mind. Yet standing there, surrounded by the smell of home-cooked meals and memories, he realized surrender would kill him faster than failure. John Carter said, "I'd rather die chasing my vision than live without it." Her eyes softened, but the silence between them was heavy with fear. The following week, disaster struck again. His supplier cut ties, citing financial instability. Factory floor stood silent, machines idle, workers gathered in uneasy clusters. John walked among them, his chest heavy with shame. He could feel their eyes, questions unspoken yet piercing. John Carter said, "This isn't the end of our journey. It's another storm to outlast." His words rang hollow, even to his own ears, but he forced conviction into each syllable. A worker stepped forward, hesitant but loyal. Silent observer said, "We believe in you, John, but we need to know you won't abandon us." The plea was quiet yet powerful, a reflection of the weight on his shoulders. He inhaled deeply, forcing his fear down. John Carter said, "I will fight until there is nothing left in me." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was filled with reluctant hope. John stood in front of his dwindling team, the warehouse echoing with emptiness where machines once roared. Fear lingered in their eyes, but so did loyalty. He felt the crushing weight of being the one they looked to for answers. John Carter said, "We are not finished. This is just another storm." His voice wavered at first, but steadied as he locked eyes with them. The silence was suffocating, until Emily stepped forward, her hand raised in solidarity. Emily Wright said, "If you fight, we fight." Her words carried strength that rekindled the fragile hope within the group. A murmur of agreement rippled through the team, the fear bending but not breaking their resolve. John swallowed his doubt, forcing his fear into fuel. John Carter said, "Then we rise together, no matter how many times they try to bury us." The words felt heavy, but they carried fire. The team's silence turned into a spark of unity. News of Richard's rising success spread like wildfire, his company unveiling a product eerily similar to John's abandoned designs. John watched the broadcast from his apartment, his jaw tight, anger boiling beneath his calm exterior. The betrayal was no longer hidden. It was plastered across screens with applause. Richard Hayes said, on TV, "Innovation rewards those bold enough to seize it." John Carter said, "You didn't seize it, you stole it." His voice was venom, though no one but the empty room heard it. Emily sat nearby, her hand gripping his arm gently, grounding him. Emily Wright said, "Then prove the world wrong, John Don." The ache in his chest deepened, but her words lit a spark. Betrayal had turned into humiliation, and humiliation burned into defiance. John Carter said, "He took my idea, but he'll never carry my vision." His voice was low, steady, and filled with quiet fury. The war had truly begun. John met the silent observer, Louis, at the edge of the factory floor, late one night. The younger man's loyalty had never wavered, but fear weighed heavily on his face. Louis said, "People are scared, John. They don't know how long they can hold on." His voice cracked under the pressure of speaking truth. John placed a hand on his shoulder, eyes steady. John Carter said, "Fear is real, but so is courage. Tell them I'm not leaving, not now, not ever." Louis's eyes glistened, his shoulders squaring as he nodded. That moment wasn't about contracts or machines. It was about the heartbeat of those who still believe. For John, the fight shifted from personal vengeance to protecting the people who still stood beside him. John Carter said, "If I fall, I'll fall with you, but if I rise, we rise together." His words carried into the silence, a vow Louis carried back to the others. At a private gala, John confronted Richard face to face, the air thick with tension as chandeliers glittered overhead. Richard raised his glass, mocking triumph dancing in his eyes. Richard Hayes said, "You should thank me, John. I've given your dream the stage it deserved." John Carter said, "You twisted it into something hollow." His words were steel, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. The crowd murmured around them, unaware of the venom exchanged in their hushed tones. Richard leaned closer, arrogance oozing. Richard Hayes said, "History remembers winners, not dreamers." John's jaw clenched, every nerve begging to strike back. Instead, he smiled faintly, defiance radiating from his restraint. John Carter said, "History remembers truth, and truth has a way of returning." The moment hung heavy, Richard's smirk faltering for the briefest second. The war between them was no longer hidden, it had stepped into the light. Returning home from the gala, John collapsed into his chair, anger clawing at his chest. The confrontation with Richard replayed in his mind like a wound torn open. His hands trembled as he picked up a sketch from the vision board, tracing the lines with shaking fingers. John Carter said, "He thinks he owns this, but it's still mine." The words were almost a whisper, but they carried defiance. Emily walked in quietly, setting a steaming mug on the table beside him. "Emily Wright," said, "then stop proving it to him and start proving it to yourself." Her voice was soft but unyielding, her gaze steady on his. He looked at her, the weight of exhaustion clashing with the fire in his chest. For a moment, the storm inside eased. John Carter said, "I will rebuild, and I will rise. Not for him, not for revenge, but for us." The vow felt like the first step toward redemption. The email arrived late at night, subject line cold and sharp, confidential documents attached. John's hands trembled as he clicked it open, the glow of his laptop casting harsh light across his weary face. Inside were files, spreadsheets and contracts, proof that Richard had been siphoning funds and manipulating investors. His breath caught, heart pounding like a drum against his ribs. John Carter said, "This isn't sabotage, it's theft." The realization struck like lightning, tearing through every shred of doubt. He scrolled further and froze. Alex Park's signature inked across hidden deals, the betrayal cutting deeper than any wound. John Carter said, "You were with him all along." The room seemed to tilt, the weight of deception crashing down. For weeks he had believed he'd simply failed, but the truth was darker. His downfall wasn't fate, it was orchestrated treachery. And now, finally, he had the evidence. John stormed into Emily's apartment, papers clenched in his fists, anger radiating from every step. Emily looked up from her desk, alarm flashing in her eyes. John Carter said, "It wasn't just Richard, it was Alex too." He slammed the files down, the impact rattling the table. Emily sifted through the pages, her expression shifting from confusion to fury. "Emily Wright," said, "he stood beside you for years, and this is what he chose." Her voice cracked under the weight of betrayal. John's jaw tightened, his chest heaving. John Carter said, "They built my downfall together piece by piece." The air between them was thick with disbelief, the enormity of treachery too heavy to ignore. Emily reached for his hand, her grip firm. "Emily Wright," said, "then we make them pay, not with vengeance but with truth." Her words steadied him, transforming anger into resolve. The revelation no longer broke him, it armed him. John confronted Alex in his office, the air heavy with tension. Alex leaned back casually, smirk curling at the corner of his lips, as if betrayal were nothing more than business. Alex Park said, "You always dreamed too big, John. Someone had to ground you." The words dripped with arrogance, but John wasn't the same man who once begged for loyalty. John Carter said, "You didn't ground me, you sold me out." He slammed the incriminating documents onto the desk, each page a dagger of truth. Alex's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he realized the evidence was undeniable. John's voice sharpened, filled with restrained fury. John Carter said, "You chose greed over loyalty, and now everyone will see you for what you are." The silence that followed was thick, Alex's mask cracking under the weight of exposure. For the first time, John stood taller, no longer broken but armed with truth. Richard hosted a press conference, cameras flashing as he boasted about his company's triumph. Reporters leaned forward, eager for sound bites. John slipped quietly into the back, clutching the evidence that could shatter Richard's empire. His pulse thundered as Richard's voice echoed across the hall. Richard Hayes said, "We succeeded because we were fearless." John Carter said under his breath, "You succeeded because you lied." When the speech ended, John stepped forward, every eye turning toward him. His presence cut the air like a blade. John Carter said, "I have proof that this man built his empire on theft." Gasps rippled through the crowd, flashes ignited like wildfire. Richard's smirk wavered, the mask slipping for the briefest second. The truth, once buried, was now dragged into the light. The hall erupted in chaos, but for John, it was the sound of justice awakening. The fallout was immediate. News channels replayed John's confrontation, headlines screaming accusations. Richard's empire wavered under scrutiny, Alex's involvement dragged into the light. Yet, amid the chaos, John felt a strange calm. Emily joined him on a rooftop overlooking the city. the night air cool, the skyline glowing like embers of possibility. Emily Wright said, "You did it, you tore down the lies." He shook his head, eyes fixed on the horizon. John Carter said, "I haven't won yet. Exposing them is just the beginning." Her hand slipped into his, steady and warm. Emily Wright said, "Then we rebuild, piece by piece." He exhaled slowly, the weight of years lifting from his chest. Betrayal had tried to end him, but truth had set him free. John Carter said, "This is where the real fight begins." The city stretched before them, no longer a battlefield of shame, but a canvas of redemption. The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet, every breath from the audience laced with anticipation. John stood tall at the plaintiff's table, papers clutched in his hand, his resolve sharper than it had ever been. Across the aisle, Richard sat smugly, his lawyer whispering in his ear. John Carter said, "This isn't just about money, it's about the truth." His words echoed in the cavernous room, cutting through the silence. Richard Hayes said, "All you have are bitter accusations." But John laid the evidence flat on the table, the betrayal etched in black and white for all to see. He felt every gaze burning into him, every heartbeat sensing with the moment. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the damning documents. For weeks, John had been torn between collapse and defiance, but now there was only clarity. John Carter said, "I was betrayed, but today I stand to reclaim what was stolen." His voice thundered with finality. As the trial unfolded, Alex was called to testify, his once cocky demeanor now unraveling under pressure. His hands fidgeted as the documents were read aloud, his signature damning him in front of the world. Alex Park said, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." His voice cracked, desperation leaking through every word. John locked eyes with him, the sting of betrayal still raw. John Carter said, "You chose greed, Alex, and you left me to burn." Alex's face paled as the judge pressed for clarity, his lies crumbling under scrutiny. Each denial faltered, replaced with stammering confessions. The crowd murmured, the tension building with every slip of truth. For John, it wasn't triumph yet, it was survival, clawed from the jaws of collapse. Richard glared, fury boiling in his eyes as his carefully spun empire began to unravel. This wasn't just a hearing, it was reckoning. Richard finally took the stand, arrogance dripping from every gesture. He leaned back, confident smirk plastered across his face, as if the world still bent to his will. Richard Hayes said, "You're nothing without me, John. A dreamer destined to fail." But John stepped closer, voice steady, fueled by fire. John Carter said, "I was a dreamer, but now I'm proof that truth is stronger than lies." He handed over the final piece of evidence, a hidden email chain revealing Richard's orchestrated sabotage. The courtroom gasped, the sound like a wave crashing. Richard's smirk faltered for the first time, anger flashing in his eyes as he realized the walls were closing in. For John, this was no longer just about redemption, it was about justice. The choice was clear, rise or fall. And in that moment, he chose to rise. His voice cut through the tension like steel. John Carter said, "Your empire ends today." The judge's gavel cracked like thunder, silencing the room. His words carried the weight of law, declaring Richard and Alex guilty of fraud and misconduct. The ruling swept through the courtroom like fire, reporters scrambling, flashes exploding as history was rewritten. John Carter said, "Justice has spoken." His voice was steady, but inside, relief and exhaustion collided like crashing waves. Emily pressed a hand against his back, her smile soft yet fierce. Emily Wright said, "You didn't just survive, you won." Tears pricked at his eyes, but he refused to let them fall in front of Richard, who sat shattered, his arrogance reduced to silence. For months John had fought against doubt, betrayal, and ruin. But here in this moment, he had conquered them all. The fight wasn't just about reclaiming what was his, it was about proving he was never broken. The courtroom roared, but John stood silent, shoulders finally unburdened. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted with reporters, cameras, and supporters pressing forward. John raised his head, the weight of years lifting under the sunlight. John Carter said, "This is not the end of my story, it's the beginning." His words were swallowed by the chaos but carried into the hearts of those who heard. Emily stood close, her hand gripping his firmly, anchoring him as the storm of noise raged around them. He no longer felt like the underdog clawing for survival. He felt like a man reborn. The scars of betrayal were still there, but they had become the steel that shaped him. Flashbulbs blinded his eyes, but he did not flinch. Instead, he embraced the light, ready to rebuild with truth as his foundation. The battle had been brutal, but the war had been worth it. John Carter said, "Now, we rise." His voice was quiet, but it thundered through history. The office was quiet, sunlight spilling through wide windows onto desks cluttered with sketches and fresh prototypes. John stood at the center, his team gathered around, their eyes filled with something he hadn't seen in months: hope. He looked at the faces that had endured storms with him, each one a reminder of why he never quit. John Carter said, "We start again, not as survivors, but as builders." The words settled over them like a blessing. Emily smiled softly, pride glowing in her eyes. Emily Wright said, "This time, we rise together stronger than before." A ripple of energy surged through the room, as if the walls themselves could feel the rebirth of a dream. For John, the noise of failure was gone, replaced by the hum of possibility. The ashes of betrayal no longer defined him. They fertilized the soil of a new beginning. John Carter said, "Let's build the future they said we couldn't." Weeks later, John pitched his revitalized vision to a new group of investors, his voice steady, every word carrying conviction carved from hardship. The presentation wasn't polished with hollow bravado. It was raw, honest, and alive. John Carter said, "This company is not built on illusion, but on resilience and truth." Investors exchanged thoughtful glances, leaning forward with genuine interest. One older investor, known for his skepticism, nodded slowly, impressed despite himself. The tension in John's chest eased, but he didn't beg for approval. He let the strength of his vision speak. Emily sat at the side, her eyes fixed on him with quiet encouragement, her presence grounding him like always. For the first time, John wasn't chasing validation. He was offering an opportunity to join something unbreakable. He ended with a promise, his voice unwavering. John Carter said, "This business will not just survive, it will lead." Outside the office, the world buzzed with news of Richard's downfall. His empire, once untouchable, had collapsed under the weight of exposed lies. John passed a newsstand, glancing at a paper showing Richard's face. Haunted, diminished, forgotten. He felt no triumph, only closure. John Carter said, "It wasn't victory, it was justice." The words were quiet, spoken only to himself, but they carried peace instead of rage. Emily walked beside him, her arm brushing his, anchoring him in the calm after chaos. Emily Wright said, "The world sees you now, not the lies." John nodded. Though he knew the real victory wasn't public perception, it was the strength he had found inside. Betrayal had scarred him, but it had also carved him into something stronger. The city street hummed with life, indifferent to battles won or lost, but within him there was stillness. The war was over. That evening, John returned to the rooftop where he and Emily had once vowed to rebuild. The city stretched endlessly below, glowing like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. He leaned against the railing, breathing in the night air, his heart steady. John Carter said, "This journey nearly broke me, but it remade me instead." Emily joined him, her hand finding his. Emily Wright said, "The scars tell the story better than any speech." Her eyes glistened with pride, not for what he had won, but for who he had become. Together, they looked out at the skyline, no longer seeing obstacles but opportunities. The silence wasn't heavy. It was filled with possibility. The storm had passed, leaving clarity in its wake. John Carter said, "The world once doubted me. Now I'll show them what resilience builds." His voice was calm, but it carried the quiet thunder of destiny. The final morning dawned bright, sunlight painting John's apartment in golden hues. He stood before his vision board one last time, tracing the sketches that had carried him from collapse to rebirth. John Carter said, "This was never just about business. It was about becoming the man who wouldn't quit." His reflection in the window showed not defeat but resilience, not despair but purpose. Emily appeared behind him, coffee in hand, her smile soft but strong. Emily Wright said, "You kept your promise, to yourself, to us." He turned, their eyes locking, the weight of everything they had endured resting in that quiet moment. For John, there was no more fear, no more doubt, only forward. He pressed a final sketch to the board, the symbol of his future, then stepped back. John Carter said, "This is the moment I knew I was ready." His voice was steady, unshakable.